Hey React learners, welcome back to Web Dev in 10. Today we are looking into another powerful React hook that is going to level up your state management game. This is the UseReducer hook. So let's get right into it and not waste any more time. So what exactly is a UseReducer hook? The UseReducer hook is a feature in React that provides a more advanced and structured way to manage the state in your components, especially when the state is complex. We discussed the concept of React state in the previous video where I explained the useState. If you haven't watched that video yet, I recommend doing so before continuing with this one. This prior understanding will help you understand the fundamentals of state management, laying a foundation for the concepts covered in today's tutorial. I'll put the link to the video in the description below so you can check it out. So how do we declare the UseReducer hook in React? We can achieve this by using the syntax displayed to you on the screen. The UseReducer hook takes in two arguments, a reducer function and an initial state. The reducer function is a regular function that takes in two parameters, which is the state and the action. It performs a specific task or updates the state based on the action type. To illustrate this concept, let's take a look at the following code example. As you can see, the reducer function takes two parameters, the state and an action. Inside the function, we use an if-else statement to check the action.type. So if action.type is equal to the state increment, we return an updated state object with the count increased by 1. Similarly, if the action type is decrement, we return the state with the count decreased by 1. And if the action type is not recognized, we simply return the current state. This task will require creating different functions for each action when using the normal useState. So this is one of the benefits of the UseReducer hook. We now know how the reducer function works. The next thing is the initial state. The initial state serves as our starting point for the state. That is, it is the first value of the state. Just like our useState hook requires an initial state, the UseReducer hook also requires an initial state. Upon calling the UseReducer hook, it returns two values, the current state and the dispatch function. To have access to these values, we can use array destructuring. If you are unfamiliar with array destructuring, feel free to let me know in the comment so I can upload a video explaining it. Now let's explore what these two values do. The state contains the current state, representing the updated values after any modifications. This is where we can access the latest state of our application. On the other hand, the dispatch function is how we call our actions. This takes in an object containing two properties, the type and an optional payload. The type is a string indicating the action to perform, such as increment action from the previous examples. And the optional payload, on the other hand, is an additional data you can send to the reducer function. Note that you don't have to send a payload, it is entirely optional. Now let's explore a shorter form and a commonly used syntax for the UseReducer hook. This is directly or immediately destructuring the array after calling the UseReducer hook. It looks something like this. At this moment, some of you might be wondering, why do I need the UseReducer when I can just simply use the useState hook? While it is true that the useState hook is excellent for state management, there are specific scenarios where the UseReducer hook works better. One of these scenarios is when dealing with complex state logic that involves multiple actions, and especially when one action depends on another. Using the useState hook can become challenging. This is where the UseReducer hook comes to the rescue. An example of such complex logic is when working with data and needing to filter based on multiple criteria. UseReducer proves to be a more suitable solution than the useState. Another importance of the UseReducer is centralized logic. By using UseReducer, you can combine your state logic in one central place, simplifying management, testing, and overall reasoning about your code. Unlike the useState, where you can have multiple useState instances and functions, instead you can just maintain one state and one reducer function, resulting in a more organized code structure, which is something all developers want. Trust me, you don't want to work on a messed up code base. The next thing is interdependent state updates. When your state updates are interdependent, meaning that one update relies on the result of another, UseReducer can offer a more streamlined solution. Managing such scenarios with individual useState instances might lead to complex and error-prone code. But with UseReducer, you can handle these interdependencies more elegantly with a centralized logic. Now that we have a generalized understanding of the UseReducer hook, we can now open our code editor to practicalize what we just learned. As usual, I've already cleaned up my source folder and I have only my index.js and app.js file. And inside my app.js file, I have 3 functions that doesn't do anything for now, which is the increase, reset, and decrease function. And also in our components, I'm returning a div containing a paragraph and 3 buttons: the increase button, reset button, and the decrease button. And I also added an onClick event on each buttons. So that is all I have in my app component for now. The first thing I'm going to be doing is declaring our UseReducer using the simplified version of the syntax I showed before. So all I have to do is const an array for the array destructuring, which returns a state and also dispatch, equals, we call our UseReducer, and inside our UseReducer we have our reducer function. You can call this anything you want, whatever you want, but it's mostly called the reducer function. But if you feel like you don't want the reducer function, you don't call it reducer, you can change it. And then our initial state. Now let's import our UseReducer from React. All I have to do is import UseReducer, and then the next thing is create our reducer function. Right here, I'm going to do const reducer equals to a callback function. And just like we said before, our reducer function takes in a state and an action. And then the next thing I'm going to create up here is our initial state. And this is going to be an object containing the count with the initial value as 0. So that is all we have to do to declare our reducer. We have access to the state, our current state, and the dispatch function, which we are going to use to call our reducer function. So now in our reducer function, we are going to write some statements to perform the action we want. The first thing we're going to write is, just like the code example I showed before, we're going to use an if-else statement. You can also use a switch statement if you want. For me, I'm going to be using an if-else statement. I don't know why, I just prefer it. So if action dot type is equal to increment, we're going to return a new state. And what's in our initial state before? It was just the count. So all we have to do is just go and return a count. But this time, we're not just returning 0 like here. We're just going to do state.count, which means the current state that we have, .count, we're going to increase it by 1. And that is it for increment. And then else if the action.type is decrement, we are going to return a count. This time we're going to be removing 1 from the state.count, -1. Also, if the action.type is reset, we are going to return count back to 0. We're going to return count back to 0. So we're going to reset the state. And else, if the action.type that was passed in is not even recognized, is neither increment, decrement, or reset, we're just going to return the state the way it is. We're not going to do anything. So that's all. You must be wondering why I am writing this in all caps. You don't have to write it in all caps. It's just common convention so that every developer can understand. This is how it is written most of the time. You just write it in all caps. When I will have the logic in our reducer function, the next thing we're going to do is use the dispatch function to dispatch either increase, decrease, or reset. And that is where we use these functions we created up here. All I have to do here is just call the dispatch function. And inside it, just like I said, it takes in a type. This type is the same type we're passing here. So we're going to pass in a type of, for increase, we're going to pass in a type of increment. And let's just copy this and do the same thing in the reset. but this time we're going to be dispatching the reset action, and also in the decrease we're going to be dispatching the decrement. Let's spell that right. Yeah. Now inside our paragraph, instead of returning 0, we're going to be returning the current state dot count. Now let's open our console. I don't think I'm console logging anything. No, let me go to the action increment and just log the state. Now let's click on increase. As you can see, the state increased by 1, and we have it here as well. So we don't continue increasing. We can also decrease and reset back to 0. Now one more thing I want to show you is where you can see your reducer. So all you have to do is just click on your app, and right here we have our reducer, the hooks we use, the reducer hook on our account, and we can increase it. It's increasing here as well, decrease and reset. So that is all we're going to be doing today. Don't forget to practice, experiment, and have fun with the UseReducer hook, because practice makes perfect.